So thank you so much, Professor Brown, for coming in today. I just wanted to ask you for a brief bio and how you got into the history of science itself.
Oh, thank you very much, Danny. I wasn't prepared for that. How did I get into the history of science? Well, I began as a zoologist, a biology student, and in our final year we were given classes on how to become good citizens. And a part of that included 4 or 5 classes on history of biology. And I thought, that's interesting. So very much like you and others in this class, I had no idea there was a thing called history of science until somebody told me. And then I thought how very fascinating it was. And I've been in the field ever since I was, I suppose I must have been 21, something like that.
So this week's unit is titled Darwin's Letters, and you seem to be the foremost expert on those. During the semester, the students will be looking at all different kinds of sources. What do you find interesting about the use of letters, and what can this kind of personal correspondence teach us?
Oh, well, it's a wonderful thing. Indeed, as you say, I have spent a lot of time thinking about letters and actively reading them and working out a historiography of why letters are important and useful. So my work's always been in the 19th century, but as you know, letters, people have written letters for forever, and they give you a very particular kind of insight into the societies where they were being generated. So for Darwin's case, or for 19th century science, let's say, all of a sudden, by looking at the letters, you get a sense of the personalities, of course, because these are mostly private correspondences. And more particularly, you also get a sense of the communities, the networks, the relationships between these people, and how science isn't just done in a vacuum. It's done by people, and it's done by people who are talking to other people. And that's what I find really interesting, that you get a strong sense of the networks of science, the communications of science through looking at the correspondence. You can get that from books, of course, you can get it from journals, but you get a deeper level of insight by also looking at letters. I wouldn't suggest that any of you should just focus on letters. You need books, you need newspapers, you need all kinds of things. All the texty things, all the visual things, all the material culture of an era to tell you what it is you want to know. But the letters add a real deep and illuminating dimension to that.
What have we and what can we learn from Darwin's own letters?
Darwin's correspondence, it's very voluminous, that's one thing. So right from the beginning, even without reading them, you hear, well, there's now 15,000 in different libraries and archives all over the world. So even without having to read them, you learn, boy, he wrote a lot of letters. And that's a significant fact. So much of Darwin's time was given over to writing, and writing letters was a really important part of his work processes. And I have become known as a bit of a specialist on how that pans out in his actual products, in his actual science, that Darwin used his own correspondence network to gather the facts. Of course, he read books and journals, but he also wrote out to people who he didn't necessarily know to gather in information. Then he used more letters to check that information by asking some of his closer friends, who are all scientists.
Right.
Did you know Mr. So-and-so who tells me that there's a particular kind of banded donkey in Bengal? Can you verify this, or where might I find more information? So he's using the letters to gather things in, he's using letters to check things, and then he's also using letters to persuade people that his ideas are interesting, and he wrote a lot of letters after The Origin of Species was published, and The Descent of Man was published, to those individuals who reviewed his writings, for example. And he would read the reviews, and then he would write to the reviewer, and he would say, "Thank you. I wonder if you quite understood what I was trying to say here, 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 and here." So he's actively using the letters to persuade.
Yeah, to convince people.
To convince, without being domineering, very gentlemanly,
Right.
but definitely pushing his way forward using this medium. He doesn't do it through publications, he
Right.
does it through correspondence, and that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah. Well, I see that we have one of his letters right in front of us. I don't know if we could
Can
show
you,
this.
do you want to show this? Are you in them? Do you
I
want to
don't
show?
know, no. It looks like it's very difficult to read. I'm interested
sure.
to know how you analyze these.
Well, the first handicap is that they're documents, obviously, from
Right.
long ago.
Yeah.
And it's handwritten. You have to be able to read the handwriting.
Yeah.
And this one dates from Darwin's university days. He's writing to his cousin, who was a big friend of his, telling him all kinds of things about beetles. And paper was expensive in those days. Probably still is, but we don't use paper in quite the same way today. So he writes this away first, and then all through the interior pages, and then on the back, and hasn't got enough space to say goodbye, so he turns it over this way and writes
Wow,
across.
you can read that. Wow.
And it's called crossing.
Huh.
And right down the bottom, you won't see it unless we give you a still clip of this. Right down at the bottom it says, "Believe me, my dear Fox," who was his cousin, "yours most sincerely, Charles Darwin." But you have to turn it, see,
Sideways.
that's the beginning and that's the end. And I'm sorry, this is just one more little thing about letters from the past. They didn't have envelopes until the middle of the 19th century. So this would have been folded like this. And you can see the fold
Yeah.
lines here and here. There's the address. And on the back, it's stuck together with a wax seal. So just as material objects, they tell you a lot about the culture of the day.
Yeah.
Not necessarily scientific culture, but about what it was like to be alive in the middle years of the 19th century.
So speaking of this culture, what can we learn from these letters about the 19th century scientific culture of the day?
Specifically scientific culture, we can see, and here I'm mostly talking about Anglo-European
Right.
culture, that people had friends, that they wanted to talk about their results with friends. At the very first moment of disseminating a fact, let's say Darwin's been making some experiments, something has turned up, and he wants to talk about it with his friends. He would do that mostly by correspondence. So he would describe what he had been doing. And I think what we're seeing in the more general sense is the very first tentative verification of some kind of scientific information, some sort of scientific fact. This is done always. The verification of science is done through people talking to each other and agreeing that this was genuine new knowledge, and that they, as experts in the field, can authenticate it. And once that's happened, which is a very social process, the information, let's say it's something from Darwin, can then be published. So we're very familiar with the process of something being published. It's discussed, people criticize it, or they accept it, they talk about it, and eventually that becomes an established part of science. I think you can see this process taking place earlier, before publication, in correspondence.
In the letters.
In the letters. For 19th century science, we can see that there's a big community. There are people writing to people across the Atlantic, across the British Channel, all trying to communicate with each other about relevant new aspects of the sciences they're investigating, and they need to have some kind of input from colleagues. You can't just make a fact on your own.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what it tells us.
So you are heading the Darwin Correspondence Project, where you look at a lot of these letters. What are the goals of the Darwin Correspondence Project, and could you possibly tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. Darwin was a very great naturalist in the middle years of the 19th century. His correspondence was very extensive and has, of course, been published in part before. What we've been doing with the current Darwin Correspondence Project is collecting every known letter written by Darwin in any archive in any part of the world, and all the letters to him that are known in any archive in any part of the world. So that's a big resource.
Yeah.
That's been done. That was done ages ago. All those letters have been digitized, they've been transcribed and put into digital form, and they've been progressively published both in book form and on the web. So the web runs a little bit behind the book publication series. So any of you can go to the Darwin Project website and see letters. You can search them digitally and pull them off the web and print them out. But there'll be, of course, text.
Right.
We're not publishing facsimiles, pictures of or JPEGs of what the letter looks like. So it's been a magnificent project. There's a very large resource there. One of the major things that has actually happened that wasn't expected in the beginning was that the letters to Darwin are often written by people who are relatively unknown to historians, so that it, by chance, turns out to be a magnificent resource for looking at natural history in the 19th century in Europe and North America, where he was mostly writing, but not always just North America. He wrote to Africa, he wrote to Australia, he wrote to India, he wrote rather lesser numbers of letters to South America, but he had a particular botanical friend in Brazil. So it's not just Darwin. That's my point. I'm being a bit long-winded. It's not just Darwin. It's an extraordinary cross-section of all those people interested in the natural historical world and in evolutionary biology in the 19th century.
Is there any, I used one of the letters from the Darwin Correspondence Project in one of my papers one time, and it was so accessible and easy to read, which is really lovely. During your research, has there been anything that has surprised you?
Oh, what did surprise me was what I've just mentioned,
Yeah.
this extraordinary access to what I think we could call the little people in the
Right.
history of science, the people that aren't known about,
Right.
that are so extraordinarily interesting. I have a favorite letter, but maybe you're going to ask me that in a moment. What have I found extraordinary about it? I found extraordinary this insight into how there were communication networks.
Right.
And of course we know that, but to live with it as your working resource, to actually try and write about this was just amazing. I enjoyed that very much.
So do you have a favorite letter?
Yes, I do have a favorite letter. I have two favorite letters. The first one relates to Darwin when he was voyaging on the Beagle, when he was such a young man. And he, had a very exciting and active time on the Beagle voyage. It was from 1831 to 1836, all around the world, but most of it spent in South America. He promised his sisters, who were in their mid-20s or so, that he would write to them regularly, and that every time he wrote, he would say when he had last written, so that they would have a record of where he was in case the letters didn't get there.
Right.
The astonishing thing is that every letter Darwin wrote to his sisters during that entire 5-year period got back to his hometown in Shrewsbury, except for one. And we know that there's one missing because he wrote about it afterwards saying, "Did you get my letter from wherever?" And it was the letter he wrote when he was on the Galapagos Islands. So I have often thought, wouldn't that be the most wonderful thing to find, that we don't have any, we have his notebooks from the Galapagos Island and we have his recollections of what he thought when he was there. But one of the valuable things about letters is that it's an on-site kind of construction of what had happened. Had that letter arrived back and was now still extant and in an archive, we would have a day-to-day account of what Darwin saw and thought on the Galapagos Islands that would be magnificent. I would so enjoy that. So that's my favourite letter. And I shouldn't say this on tape, but I've often thought, wouldn't that be fun to kind of write that? We could make up all kinds of extraordinary things of what Darwin thought on the Galapagos Islands. And actually, if we were really going to do this, and I really shouldn't say this, we have a very extensive supply of words in Darwin's own handwriting, so we could actually create one if we wanted.
So you said you had two favorite letters.
Yes, and my other one is a much more sort of academic favorite one. It's just before Darwin published The Origin of Species. He was consulting with his great friend, the geologist Charles Lyell, asking him all kinds of things and valuing Lyell's response. And there's one where Darwin wrote to him, and Lyell, like lots of us, even today, found Darwin's handwriting a bit difficult to read. And Lyell wrote back saying, Lyell actually cut out a word from a letter and sent it back to Darwin saying, "What's this?" And it turns out that the word was preservation. And Darwin had been writing about natural preservation in a letter. And the reason it's my favorite letter is that Lyell thought it was persecution.
Oh no.
And Darwin writes back saying, you know, it's actually natural preservation. I was talking about natural selection, but persecution really is the right word now that you mention it. So that's kind of fun as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today. I guess for my last question, how did you develop and cultivate your passion for Darwin over the years?
Oh, I have, as I said, I was a biologist at the beginning. Darwin's always been a hero figure for lots of biologists. Our work today in biology is still very much based on the principles that Darwin put forward. Of course, it's been expanded and changed and developed and improved and all kinds of things, but it's still recognizably Darwinian. So I've always been interested in him. And then it was encountering the correspondence. As a young graduate, I just got my PhD. I went to work on the correspondence as an editor in England. And to be inside an archive like that, to encounter someone's personality, and not just his personality, but his family and all the other things that are happening, and to watch an individual grow, a scientist grow as well, was wonderful. And I think if anyone engages for a longish period of time with some of those letters, you would also feel the same thing. So it's both personal, it's a really interesting personal archive. You see so much about Victorian social life, and my special interests lie actually in the women in Darwin's life, his wife, his daughters, his sisters. So I've learnt a lot about the social history of 19th century England through that correspondence. But you also see a scientist, a thinker, someone who was going to turn out to be a really significant figure, growing, developing, working things through, tentatively exploring one theory and another theory, and then eventually publishing, and then having to support it. You see all that panning out in this long and large archive.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I think that's good timing too. Yeah.
Good.
I think it's supposed
You got
to be-
another class?
Oh, no.
Oh,
Good
okay.
timing as in, it's supposed to be relatively